to make us ready to compete with growing powers in the world. It is not just a technical problem. It is not just a problem for technocrats. What is one of the barriers we face, one of the obstacles we face, is weakness of European identity, of European conscience. We remind ourselves that we are Europeans when we are somewhere in Asia, in Africa, when we face different civilization, different culture, different habits, and so on and so on. Here in Europe, we think much more often about ourselves as Poles, Germans, Spaniards, French, and etc., etc. Being European is kind of abstractive idea. It is, I think that most of us do not feel it as strongly as our national identity. From this point of view, we are very different from many Americans who have no problems with combining two types of identities. They feel to be Americans, they feel to be citizens of the United States, but many of them are very proud of where are their roots, of sharing, at least to some extent, the other national identity. We should think about that. If we are not able to create, to strengthen European identity, we will not become, what was also mentioned here, a really united and strong political partner for other powers in the world. So I believe this is a kind of great idea we should think about together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Mrs. Monika Maron, please.
Also mein Blick auf Europa.
Well, my outlook on Europe is not from the top tiers of politics. I'm rather looking up from below, from the perspective of those who are being governed. 20 years ago, when in Hungary people were still cutting holes into the fence to Austria, when in Poland Solidarność were already part of the government and had fought for the first non-communist prime minister, when in Berlin the wall came down, when 20 years ago, or rather 21 years ago, Europe started again to become one Europe, with a past of wars, of course, with different cultures that have the same root. For the Eastern and Central Europeans, Europe had disappeared in the mist of the past for more than 5 decades. We were the bloc, the Eastern Bloc. In Hungary was the probably most humorous shack there, and the resistance against the Soviet Union manifested itself in a form of national conscience in order to assert your identity that seemed to be absolutely and completely lost in the political and economic relations. The people living east of the river Elbe in Germany did not even have that, because there were Germans on the other side of the river. The Eastern Germans became members of members of the population of the GDR, and now they are again real Europeans that live in peace that is secured by contracts. They can travel between different locations just as they can travel between the cities of their own country. They pay with a single currency in most European countries, and when traveling to other continents, they feel the deep relations they have to their European neighbors. That is the emotional part of being a European that we appreciate and that we love and that we enjoy in thankfulness. And then there is the EU. I am not a politician, and neither do I understand anything about the economy. My expertise on this topic is limited to the result of an interested observation of political proceedings and the perceptions of the public that hardly ever differ from my own. People perceive the European Union when talking about subsidies. It's either in a positive or in a negative way, depending on whether you benefit from it or not, or when they experience, just as they do now, how hard it is on the governmental level to harmonize the interests of 27 member states. But we the population are confronted with the European Union most frequently when talking about regulations spanning a vast area ending with the angle of cucumbers. Perhaps it is just as what Mr. Karl-Theodor said when fighting against the fixed prices of books and fighting against all odds, be it book dealers or others, because the books and the computers on which they were written, he did not see a real distinction. I did not remember his name, Karl-Theodor, but I did remember his fighting the fixed prices for books. As opposed to national politics, European politics remains a faceless one. We hardly know our own members of parliament or commissioners, and even less that of the other 26 member states that also have a say in determining our fates. The European Parliament remains more or less anonymous and alien, which makes it understandable that people do not really trust all the decisions, and also explains the low level of participation in European elections. It should be our best representatives working on the European level, also reflecting their own population. But you may get the impression that Brussels is just the end of a one-way street. You know, if you don't have enough voters in Germany, you will then be sent over to Brussels. Or it was the example of Włodzimierz, for example, who stumbled across some financial inconsistencies and was then sent off to the European Parliament for a couple of years. It is hard to understand on the European level who will assert their position and their interests against whom and why. But the opinion, that is rather more of an emotion, that in Brussels we have a plethora of people who are so fond of regulations, whose endeavors not only threaten the fixed prices of books, but also raw milk cheese from France. This is an emotion that is so widely spread that people seem to think that losing a national identity seems to be something of a benefit. There is the impression that losing your national identity seems to be some kind of prerequisite for the economic unity in Europe. But we have on the other side the variety and the diversity and the traditions and the different economic preconditions that countries start off with. I think it could be subjected to a kind of European thinking that does not even need this kind of sacrifice. Defending your own identity when it comes to cheese or cultural achievements like fixed book prices, I hardly see a kind of national egotism in these things. But what about the billions of payment for Greece that the German government and all the other states burdened themselves with overnight in the name of their peoples? Well, probably there was no choice. But then it became public knowledge that falsified balances had passed the desks in Brussels in a totally unregulated fashion, and that Greece was in no way possible to fulfill the accession criteria in the past. Well, who will now control that these things do not happen in the future again? Is it really egotism if Germans ask themselves why the Greek would go on strike because they now have to face an increase of their age of pensioning from 60 to 63, while they are discussing about old age pensions at the age of 67. Is that egotism or a justified question? The case of Greece did not really strengthen confidence in the EU, and much less in the plans for granting other countries accessions. In all European countries, there are problems with parts of the Muslim population. In Germany, we have 4 million people with this background, most of which come from Turkey. A major part is not or badly integrated, with hardly a link to the country they are living in. This problem has now been discussed, despite the fact that it had been ignored for a rather long time. We just started the public discussion and made way for this public discussion in order to deal with the explosive situation that built up over decades. And at the same time, the EU accession of Turkey is something that people seem to be too